Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 24. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of The Agincourt Bride, The Tudor Bride, Red Rose, White Rose, First of the Tudors, The Tudor Crown, and The Lady of the Ravens. Hello, Joanna Hickson.
Hello, how nice to be here.
How are you?
Well, I'm pretty well, really, considering all. Nothing happens much because apart from my neighbour having COVID and I'm keeping well away from her, That's me, really. I'm writing.
First, I hope your neighbour is doing well, but also on you had a holiday recently.
Oh, yes, I did. I went all the way across to Suffolk. We live just near Bath, so it's right on the sort of west side of the country, and Suffolk, obviously, is right on the east side, so it's quite a nice long drive to get there, but we had a lovely time. And although I had lived in Constable country, where I sort of found my first book, we visited lots of places that I'd seen before, but it was a sort of nostalgic trip, and the weather was fantastic, and we had a great time.
Yeah, lovely. You mentioned your first books there. So tell us about your earlier work. I know I saw on Twitter when I was researching your work that you had a young adult novel. So you've been publishing for a lot longer than I know that I knew, and that your adult medieval novels would suggest.
Well, it sounds as if I have, because that one was published in Don't Breathe Now, but 1978. So, actually nearly 1979. And as you say, it was for young adult, 10 years up really, and it was a historical novel, and it was set in a castle called Orford Castle on the Suffolk coast. So obviously I've recently been there again, and you may have seen a picture of me on Twitter in front of that fantastic castle. It really is outstanding, and it was very old. It was started in 1174 and I think completed in about 2 years. It was very quick. It was part of Henry VII's attempt to intimidate his local magnate, who was Hugh Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, and he had a big castle about 11 miles away from Orford. And it was the sort of central place in that part of the world at the time, and Henry II got a bit dodgy about him and thought he needed to be sorted out. So he built this enormous castle on the very coast of Suffolk in order to deter the French and to deter the Earl of Norfolk. However, there was a rebellion and the Earl tried to bring the French in, and the story was set in that rebellion. It was in 1174, and the story involved the family of the Orford Castle Constable. The constable, as you know, probably was the man appointed by the king to run his castles. And it's especially centred around his teenage children, Robert and Alice. And they foil a conspiracy and an attempted French invasion. Very exciting.
It sounds like a bit of a medieval Famous Five almost, that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, that sort of thing, very much.
That's good then. So the intimidation, it was warranted then?
Well, it certainly was. And actually, my coup was that it went out on the big sort of children's TV programme Jackanory. I was actually working at the time for the BBC in Scotland and doing a daily live sort of music and news programme at exactly the same time that it was broadcast on Jackanory. So I never heard it. I don't know what it was like, because there's no possibility of recording TV off air at that time. But I did manage to get hold of one episode eventually, so I had a quick listen. But anyway, it was quite a coup, my first coup in publishing. And then I stopped publishing. I haven't done any again until I started The Agincourt Bride.
That is a wonderful story, and it's very cool, and I'm glad that you did get to see it. That's good. So, listeners, today we are going to focus on Joanna's 3 latest novels, because she has got quite a few. These are First of the Tudors, The Tudor Crown, and The Lady of the Ravens. They are all particularly connected, as they take us from the early days of the War of the Roses through to Henry VII's coronation and beyond. First of the Tudors focuses on Jasper Tudor, who was the uncle of Henry VII, which is really interesting to me, Joanna, because you just don't hear so much about him. So I'm going to have to ask, why Jasper Tudor?
Well, for that very reason, really, because I felt that he had been grossly neglected. My new novels tend to emerge from the previous one that has just been published, and that one, The First of the Tudors, started right after The Tudor Bride, where I'd left Catherine de Valois' 2 young Tudor sons with the nuns at Barking Abbey, and I became very curious about their future. Catherine de Valois is, of course, the great-grandmother of the Tudor dynasty. She is the Princess of France who married King Henry V. And their marriage was very short, unfortunately, and she produced young King Henry VI, who came to the throne at 9 months old because Henry V died at a siege in France, rather unexpectedly and too young, really. So my research wanted to pick up on these two Tudor sons who Catherine had with Owen Tudor. And so it picks them up at the court of their half-brother, King Henry VI, who by this time is an adult, but he hasn't actually managed to have any children yet. So he'd been feeling the lack of family support and took his half-brothers, these two brothers by Catherine de Valois and Owen Tudor, and their names were Edmund and Jasper, and he took them under his wing and brought them to court. And I just thought that it would be a good story to follow one of them, and unfortunately Edmund didn't make old bones, so I decided Jasper was the better one. And from what I could glean from the historical sources, they were two very different characters, and actually Jasper was the one I fell in love with. So I've got a little reading here if you'd like to hear it.
Yeah, go for it.
Just right from the beginning of First of the Tudors. It just shows you maybe why I fell in love with Jasper, not Edmund. Flashes of iridescence gleamed like fireflies in the gloom of the small tower chamber. I stared at the river of fabric as it settled in graceful waves across the bed. It was the intense blue of a noon sky, yet it glittered with the gold of midnight stars. "Do you think she'll like it?" Edmund asked. I took a deep breath, hesitating to prick my brother's bubble. "Yes and no," I said. "What do you mean?" Indignation raised the timbre of his voice. "Geez, you Jazz! A gown fashioned of such fabric would make any female feel like a queen." My hackles rose. I hated Edmund calling me Jazz, and had told him so on numerous occasions. Yet still he persisted. It was a boyhood nickname, and we were no longer boys, but squires in the service of the king, soon to become knights. My name was Jasper. I'd stopped calling him Ed on the day we came to court. "But she's not a queen, and there are sumptuary laws. Our sister could be royally fined for wearing a gown made from such fabric. You know its use is restricted to royalty, archbishops, and the effigies of saints." I touched the cloth, admiring its shimmer as the slight movement stirred it into life. It was soft and sinuous under my fingers. I imagined the deft fingers that had wound the fine gold wire around the warp fibres with infinite skill and patience. Edmund was right. Wearing it would make anyone feel illustrious. Cloth of gold! Just how had Edmund come up with the huge price it commanded? Edmund drew himself up to his 6-foot height. "The daughter of a queen may wear what she likes. They would not dare to find her." Exasperated, I flipped the fabric so that it rippled like a sudden flurry on a calm lake. "Your head is in the clouds, brother. Come back to earth. Our sister lives in Tun Lane, London. Nobody knows what we know. In her world, she is not Margaret, just Meg, and she's about to marry the man of her choice, who is not a prince, but a lawyer. She will be a wife, and, God willing, a mother. She's a happy, warm lady, and with enough money for her needs. Whatever you dream for your own future, do not wish it on her." Irritably, Edmund twitched the length of fabric into his arms, gathering it in like a shield against reality. "I know what she is, and what she has chosen to remain, but she is still the daughter of a queen, the granddaughter of a king, and I will give her the honour of royal raiment, even if she never wears it." I shrugged. "So be it, but you've wasted your money. And do not dare to reveal her true birth by so much as a whisper at the wedding." So they're off to the wedding of this sister that they have, who was actually born to Catherine and Owen Tudor, but we know nothing about her, and it's possible that she died at birth, but I took her into real life and made it a sort of side story.
I'm actually really kind of pleased that you picked that bit, because it was at that point in the book, the chapter around it, that I realised just how immersive this book was going to be. And that's something I do want to point out to listeners if you haven't read these books. If you want something that's medieval, that really gives you so much knowledge, these are the books.
Your words are music to my ears.
I loved reading it. It was brilliant. Jane, she's in your timeline. You've got the timeline at the front of the book. We know that Jasper Tudor did acknowledge some children, but where did you go about creating her, I suppose?
Well, Jane, again, sort of emerges from the book that I wrote about the marriage between Catherine de Valois and Owen Tudor, because the Tudor family was at the time based in Anglesey, which is, as everyone knows, is an island off Wales. And when Owen became a member of Catherine's household and went with her when she was forced to retire from court by the Royal Council, he wanted some, friends really amongst the other people who went with him. And so he brought two of his cousins from Wales. And this is all fact. One of them was called Hywel ap Fictionine. Please excuse my Welsh accent, which is appalling, but anyway, that's kind of how they pronounce it. And Hywel comes, therefore, into this particular book because he was the father of this Sian, or Jane, and they had been forced to leave Anglesey because one of their neighbours became anti them and set fire to their farm, and generally they had to flee. So they fled to the English mainland, and it's there that Owen takes his two boys to meet their cousins, one of whom is Jane, and there are some boys who are also quite important in the story. So all this sort of carries on. I like to kind of link everything together so that my books have a family thread. And one of the gaps in history that I chose to fill is with Hywel, who actually married one of my invented characters, who was a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine, and came with her also into her kind of exile from court. So when they fled from Anglesey to the mainland, they set up a farm, and she taught all her children French, which was quite good because she was herself French. She didn't manage to teach Hywel French, but she taught Jane some French, and she taught the other three boys that they had. So Jane eventually becomes nursemaid to the baby Henry at Pembroke Castle, but this is all jumping into the rest of the story.
Well, we'll carry on in a moment, but I have got a question that's in context, but it will sound completely out of context, so sorry for that, listeners. But I think this is the time to ask it. I started out when I was a young child as a strong red rose. Then as I got older and I read more, I was more for the white rose. And your books have actually changed me back again.
Yeah, well, that's good, because I'm very pleased to hear that.
Yeah, no. So I would like to ask you, it says on your Twitter bio that you are not a Ricardian. Obviously, in your books, it does suggest that you aren't. So can you expand on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a great fan of Richard of Gloucester. A lot of people are, and I wondered why, because I couldn't see anything that made me support him in any way. When I went in detail into this period, the Wars of the Roses particularly, and afterwards, because I don't know, it just occurred to me that there must be something that had made him so popular, particularly among Americans. Because when I was doing this research, I went on a research trip, and I was with a busload of Americans who were looking for the Bosworth battlefield. And I was the only sort of English person there. And I kept asking them, why are you so keen on Richard III? This is ridiculous. And they were saying, well, we all read him at high school, and he was the set book. I said, what do you mean he was the set book? And they said, oh, that Josephine Tay, she wrote Daughters of Time. Aha. So I suddenly got the message, you see, because Daughters of Time, written by this writer, Josephine Tay, who now is dead, but is still in print, and you can all read it if you want to, listeners, if you haven't, and see what you think, because she sets out through her modern-day detective to prove that Richard III did not kill the princes in the Tower. So that's really why I realised that the Americans all, or the American ladies particularly, it seemed, fell in love with Richard of Gloucester. I hope you followed that. It's quite difficult.
No, it was fine. Well, on that note, who do you think killed the princes?
He cunningly made himself King of England after his brother Edward died, who was no angel either, I have to say, and then went on and stole the role of king from his young nephew. You all know that, the uncrowned King Edward V, who he then took to live at the Tower with his brother Richard, the Tower of London, that is. Well, he was king. He'd made himself king. Parliament had passed the act that said that his brother's children were illegitimate because he had made a previous contract with another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. So as king, he was in charge. I mean, he has to be held responsible for anything that went on in his reign regarding the royal family, or even though he's made them not royal, he must be held responsible for their disappearance from the Tower of London. He would not maybe have done it himself, but it hardly matters who was actually detailed off to do the murder. He or they would simply have been under orders, and the person who gives the order, in my mind, is just as guilty as the person who carries it out. So it was him. And it just doesn't make me like him very much. Sorry.
No, I think that's entirely understandable. I liked how was it The Lady of the Ravens? I can't remember right now, but you've got the idea that Henry VII could have called the order, which is obviously one of the other things that people think about.
Indeed, yes. That was one of the things that sort of, it was a rumour that went round London, particularly when Henry VII came to London, which was shortly after the Battle of Bosworth. He was a bit put out, actually, because he had asked for his bride-to-be, he thought. He had sworn to marry Elizabeth of York, who was the eldest daughter of Edward IV. He was trying to unite the Yorkists and the Lancastrians together to make a new dynasty, his own dynasty, the Tudor dynasty. So he got a bit put out when the crowd who greeted his bride-to-be, Elizabeth, who was at that time illegitimate, or supposedly illegitimate, he was a bit put out that the crowd had liked her better than him. I mean, they didn't come in together or anything. She came in first, actually, and there'd been a great crowd, and, everyone had cheered and welcomed her and said, "Oh, you're back, great, great." And then he came in, and it was all a bit quiet because they didn't really know who he was. I mean, he'd been in exile for 14 years, and before that he'd been in Wales. And so he was hardly known at all to the English, and yet he'd suddenly made himself their king. It was quite a tough time for the English population at that time to work it out. But I think in terms of him marrying Elizabeth, they were prepared to accept him, if he did marry Elizabeth, which was not a given, actually. But that we can talk about that a bit later, maybe.
Do you think your interest in Henry VII is interwoven with your feelings for Richard, or are they completely separate?
No, I'll take you up, because I'm going to say that it really had very little to do with Richard until I got into the Tudor Crown. So during the first of the Tudors, it didn't really feature much at all, because Richard was just somebody who fought for his brother Edward IV. But in the Tudor Crown, he became more and more important as the book went on, and I began to do more and more research into him. So yes, I mean, I had already got a great interest in this little baby that had been born as a result of the marriage between Edmund Tudor and this girl. I mean, she was only 12, Margaret Beaufort, who probably everybody who's interested in historical fiction has heard of. And she, was about the best catch of the decade when she married Edmund. And Edmund Tudor was only just arrived at court. He'd been made a knight, but the king wanted him to be an earl. I mean, that was the idea. So when he married this girl, who was only 12, he became the Earl of Richmond. And that was the marriage, that was done. And Jasper was a bit put out because he quite fancied Margaret as well, as you can imagine. I mean, she had a lot of land and money, and she was a direct descendant from the throne of Edward III. So she had a claim to the throne as well. Made her very interesting indeed as a spouse. However, Edmund was the oldest, so he got the goods, really. And so my interest in Richard really didn't even start until much later on. I can go on about Margaret Beaufort, though, the other narrator in my book, The Tudor Crown, and she is the mother of Henry. Her story, I think, is quite extraordinary, if we want to get into that.
Yes, go for it. Very much, yeah.
Okay, yes, I have a great soft spot for her because I feel she's been really badly represented by a series of other historical fiction writers, particularly not so much recently, but in the last decade. And she, as far as my research went, I could not find this dominating matriarch or the religious zealot that some of my colleagues have depicted. So, I decided that I'd make her central to Henry Tudor's life because although they didn't get together very often, poor things, I mean, she was only 13 when she gave birth to him and nearly killed both of them. And Jasper had been her hero when Edmund had been taken prisoner and then died after a sort of skirmish outside Carmarthen Castle in Wales. And he had gone and left this 13-year-old pregnant girl all on her own. So when Jasper came to her rescue and carried her off to Pembroke Castle, which was his castle, she then needed company, and the company that he chose to bring to her as a nursemaid, really, for the child, was Jane Hywel. Oh, you see, the link is there. And Jane Hywel then, of course, later proved to be Jasper Tudor's mistress. It's getting quite complicated, isn't it? Let's go back to Margaret Beaufort, because after she gives birth to Henry, who is later Henry VII, she is not allowed to keep him. The king insists that she marry again, and so she is married again to the Duke of Buckingham's brother, Henry Stafford. And they have another claim to the throne, so there we go. We're really getting, a few claims to the throne lined up, ready for the Battle of Bosworth, really, and the things that existed before that, which were various rebellions and things that went on in Richard III's reign. So Margaret also, when she was older, slightly older, and she rather liked Henry Stafford, who she married. He was a nice man, and everything went quite well between them, but it didn't go very well with Edward IV, who thought she was too much of a Lancastrian and didn't really want her around. But eventually she managed to ease her way into the court, and she became a lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth Woodville. She aimed to restore her son, Henry, to his rightful earldom of Richmond. That was one of her aims, but she also took in children. I mean, she had quite a number of wards. She had them in custody. If they were orphans or their fathers had died in battle or something, the king would farm these children out to various places in order to give them an upbringing. And she had quite a few. She gave them super educations. And that's where my next heroine comes in, Joan Vaux, who was one of her wards. And that's where we jump again to Our Lady of the Ravens, but we can come back to that later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, should we break for a reading of the Tudor Crown?
Indeed, we certainly can, because the Tudor Crown is the one that follows Henry Tudor from age 14. Jasper actually happened to be a cousin of Louis XI of France, so he had plenty of contacts in France and thought he would be able to make a living there for a while, and took Henry with him. So they had to leave Wales, and they left in a small boat in the middle of the night from Tenby in Wales, and it wasn't an easy crossing, as you'll hear. Tossing the spray from her bow, the little cog swooped into another deep trough, then ploughed her way up to the next luminous white crest. The wind folded the night around us with sighs and groans, turning the black ocean into a fearsome monster. We were sailing into a nameless void over waves as high as castle walls, leaving behind everything I had ever known, with faint hope of return. Well, the I in this case is Henry Tudor. The helmsman hauled on the whipstaff, swiping salt water from his beard with the other hand. The Mary Gwyn may be a small ship, my lord, but she is sturdy. She swims like a porpoise. Only while on the surface, grunted my uncle, lending his arm to steady the jerking rudder. Visibility was restricted to the narrow beam of one horn lantern and the scant reflected light of a sickle moon, which frequently disappeared behind racing clouds. Stars, too, appeared and disappeared like guttering candles, making navigation well nigh impossible. Clearly, our safety could not be guaranteed in these conditions. After countless crossings of the English Channel, Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, could read the weather signs as well as any sailor, and I detected his uneasiness about what lay ahead. But it had been essential to leave harbour under cover of darkness in order to escape our Yorkist enemies. I was clinging to a cleat on the windward bulwark of the aft castle, feeling the swell and spill beneath me as the small ship danced from crest to crest. It was the first time I'd been to sea, and I was filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Despite everything, we managed to sail clear of the islands off South Wales and into the deep ocean, heading for the Cornish coast. On this wind we should reach Land's End by sunrise, said the mariner cheerfully, giving us enough light to tack safely up the English Channel and across to France, and enough for Edward's spies to spot us. Lord Jasper was not reassured. My uncle's mood had been consistently gloomy ever since the dire news had reached us of King Henry's death in the Tower of London. When he cursed the Yorkists and derided their official announcement that his half-brother had succumbed from melancholy and displeasure on being told of the battlefield death of his 17-year-old son and heir, I had echoed his contempt. I knew the old king had been somewhat weak in the head, But I too had no doubt whatsoever that Henry VI of England had been murdered. It mattered not which of the 3 York brothers had ordered or executed the dreadful deed, Edward, who now called himself king, or George, Duke of Clarence, or Richard, Duke of Gloucester. A quagmire of unlawful deaths fouled their footprints. In the 14 years since my birth, they or their adherents had scythed through the Lancastrian leadership like the Grim Reaper. First the Dukes of Suffolk and Somerset, then my father, Lord Jasper's brother Edmund Tudor, then my grandfather, their father, Sir Owen Tudor, then Prince Edward of Lancaster, and now his father, the true anointed monarch of England, to say nothing of the unfortunate cohort of less exalted followers. Only we are left to recover the throne of our forefathers, Harry, Lord Jasper had lamented as a Yorkist army laid siege to us in his castle at Pembroke. But to do it, we must stay alive, and for that, regrettably, we must flee the kingdom.
Fabulous, thank you.
So you can tell from that things were a bit dire for them, and they actually didn't end up in France at all, because there was this big storm that blew them around the coast of Brittany, and they ended up landing right at the very end of Brittany and becoming prisoners of the Duke of Brittany, who was a sort of separate item from the French. At that time, Brittany was a country of its own and it had its duke. They spent about the next 12 years in Brittany.
It's a long time, and it's easy to forget, I think, when you are reading books and things, that this was such a lengthy period that he was in exile, effectively.
Indeed, and of course during that time, before that, he hadn't known his mother hardly at all. And of course he never knew her during that exile. So his family was Jasper, basically. And then he also became very friendly with the Duke of Brittany, who sort of took him under his wing, a bit like a sort of surrogate son, because he never did have a son.
I think we should come back to Margaret, because I think your interest in her is obvious from you talking about her. So I would like to ask you another question about that.
Yeah.
Do you think that Henry would have been able to do what he did and get to the throne without Margaret's input?
Well, of course, he desperately needed military input, which she couldn't give, and which he got. But of course, also he needed money, which she had a lot of. So she did help him very much in that vein. And she also helped him in the sense that she kept in touch with him all the time in letters. So her letters are really supportive of him. I mean, she encourages him. She asks him all the time if he's getting enough education. He's always very keen on education. And is he getting the sort of training and upbringing for a potential Earl of Richmond? She's very interested in her raising her family image. But she's also very interested in her son getting what she believes he is owed, which is the earldom of Richmond. At this time, she isn't looking in the early days of his exile to make him king at all, because, there is a king on the throne, and she rather concentrates on trying to get Edward IV to allow her son back into England as Earl of Richmond, not as the king. And of course, Edward IV is very iffy about this, takes him ages and ages to decide whether or not he will do that. And eventually she manages to persuade him that Henry can return and become Earl of Richmond again. But unfortunately, it was only written down in a letter sort of by Edward IV and not ever passed by Parliament. So then Edward IV, of course, unexpectedly died. So when Richard came on to the throne eventually, with all the death of the princes in the Tower and that sort of thing, he was absolutely no fan of Elizabeth Woodville's children at all. And so he wouldn't have wanted Henry anywhere near either, because he was a threat to his throne. So that meant that she lost the possibility of bringing her son back as an earl. And there was then the first rebellion under Richard III, started by the Duke of Buckingham, who, as we know from the conversation miles back, was a cousin of Henry's, and had actually written to him in France, because he'd already gone to France by now, to ask him if he'd like to take part in the rebellion he was planning. And Henry had agreed to do so, and had managed to get about 2,000 men and bring a flotilla of ships across the Channel to support him. But rather foolishly, I think, the Duke of Buckingham had decided to start his rebellion early, without telling Henry. So Henry was late to start with. And then there was really bad weather, and the Duke of Buckingham's rebellion just literally fell apart because nobody wanted to fight in downpours of rain. Also, there were floods in the west of England and the Welsh border, which is where most of Buckingham's support came from. They all fled back to their families, really, to rescue their farms. So he didn't do too well, and he got taken prisoner and soon lost his head, obviously, because Richard wasn't going to have somebody who thought he was going to be king next anywhere around. So he was beheaded in Salisbury for some reason. I don't quite know why. Perhaps that's just where he was. And Henry had the luck to try and get into Plymouth Harbour, but when he tried to take a boat from his big ship into the harbour, he noticed that there were Yorkist soldiers on the dock, and he just ordered an about turn, and they all went back to France. So he never actually put his feet on England even then.
There was a lot of toing and froing, I found, especially like the Earl of Wiltshire. I mean, that's someone different, I know.
Oh, he was marvellous, yes. The fleeing Earl.
Yeah.
Well, it is quite hard to follow. I mean, the Wars of the Roses are difficult because they do come and go, and people die, and there are battles one after another. But they didn't really too much affect the common people, if I might call them that, unless they lost a loved one who was in an army. I mean, they didn't sort of tramp over property and upset, the sort of general economy. They weren't the sort of battles that everybody thinks they were. I mean, the battles were, but the country didn't sort of shrink in any way under the Wars of the Roses.
Definitely something that reading your work emphasises, I think, which is really nice. It is nice to know that they could get on and have their war and leave everybody else, just living their life.
They're living out of it, yes.
So, as we're talking about Margaret and we've mentioned Jane or Shan, it seems right to ask this question. You seem to me to place a distinct emphasis in your work on filling in the gaps left by history where women are concerned. Would this be correct to say?
I love gaps. I think every historical fiction writer loves a gap because that's where we can move in. Obviously, there's lots of sources and one reads them and one gleans a lot of what went on at the time. But there's very little written or published at the time of the 15th century about the women. I mean, obviously the queens get a little bit of attention and some of the noble women, but there's nothing at all about any of the sort of lesser subjects of the country. And I like to try and dig them out simply because they're interesting to me. I mean, I'm slightly more interested in the silk women of London, as I have in Lady of the Ravens, than I am in the court of Elizabeth of York, although I obviously do that as well. And that's why I wanted to find this Joan Vaux. She changed her name when she married to Guildford, so she was Joan Guildford, and she's quite a big character in the courts of Henry VIII and Henry VII's children. But she does also serve Queen Elizabeth of York.
Well, shall we have that reading from the Lady of the Ravens?
Yeah, good idea. Joan came in right at the very, very end of the Tudor Crown as the sort of companion and servant of Elizabeth, who had been held up in a castle in Yorkshire by Richard III as a matter of safety because he didn't want her suddenly disappearing on him. But then, obviously, when he died, Henry had her brought to London and lodged with his mother. And then she needed a companion. And Joan had been working with Margaret Beaufort for a long time. Elizabeth was staying at Cold Harbour and more or less waiting to be married to Henry VII. I pick up for this reading just before his coronation the Act of Royal Title, which was the Act of Parliament which had rendered her, this is Elizabeth, illegitimate under Richard III. It hadn't been wiped off the books. So it wasn't until after his coronation and during his first Parliament that Henry managed to have that act completely removed from the country's laws, and she became once more Princess of the Crown. So that made her eligible to marry him. If she hadn't married him before at his coronation, then she would have had to sit behind all the noble ladies of the land because she wouldn't be noble. That was his reason for not inviting her to the coronation. How well do you get on with your sister Cecily, Lady Elizabeth? I tried to slip this question in casually as I helped her to dress on the day of King Henry's coronation, knowing that her mind would be occupied and that she might not question the query, but she did. Why do you ask, Joan? It's been suggested that you might appoint her as your chief lady in waiting after your marriage, of course. When I'm queen, you mean? Her chin lifted. Who made the suggestion? Was it the king's mother? Blood rose to my cheeks. Well, yes, it was Lady Margaret. Does that matter? Elizabeth gave a considered sniff. No, not really. But now I know why she snubbed me and commanded your presence the other day when she came visiting, without greeting me first. That will not happen when I am queen. I will be first lady, and she will walk behind me, whether the king likes it or not. I was reared to be a queen, Joan. She was not. She turned to gaze out of the window, which faced west, the direction in which lay Westminster. I do not need anyone to tell me how to perform my duties, or what respect I should be owed. I bit my lip before responding. I do not believe there was any disrespect behind the suggestion that you might appoint your sister as your chief attendant. Lady Margaret thought you might feel more comfortable with a member of your family at your side. I will have the king at my side. He will be my family, and when we have children, so will they. I dared to pursue the point. Does that mean you'd prefer not to appoint Lady Cecily? The expression of offended nobility left her face and was replaced by one of mischievous intent. No, it means I will do my own appointing, and when I require her help, I will ask for it. You can tell Lady Margaret that if you like, Joan.
Talking of Joan and obviously this Lady of the Ravens, can you tell us about the inspiration for the Ravens and how you worked in to be a centre part of your novel?
Ah, yes. Well, the Ravens was really the centrepiece of my mind when I first decided to do this book, because it all started right at the end of the Tudor Crown when it was about to be published. And me and my editor and publisher and agent went off for lunch to celebrate. We went to a restaurant which is just across the river from the Tower of London. And I had been to a party the night before, I think. Anyway, I'd been to some event, and I was feeling a bit under the weather, really. And so I was sort of gazing across the river at the Tower of London, and the other three were sort of getting on with it, talking about what I was going to do next. They finally sort of nudged me and said, what are you thinking of doing? And I just said, the Tower of London looks like a good sort of place to centre a book. And they said, oh, yes, that's a really good idea. So that's really how it started. You know, it was like just a sort of lunchtime remark. And so I started to get interested in the Tower of London. And also, when I went to visit it, I managed to get a meeting with the Raven Master there. He's a lovely man called Chris Scaife. And he's written a book himself, which is really good. You should read it. It's called The Raven Master. He knows all about ravens. And I just sort of took a great shine to the ravens there, especially to one called Merlina, who is the sort of queen of the ravens there. I went to visit, and Merlina treated me with disdain, as I thoroughly expected her to, because I was talking to her father, really, her father figure. So I wanted then to sort of link up the story of Henry VII's reign with the Tower of London and with the legend that, you know, if the ravens left the Tower of London, then the kingdom would fall, and so would the tower. And that was really the beginning of it all. And I went back with a synopsis of a story, which included ravens and included Joan and included all these things that I started off on in the Tudor Crown. That was the story. So the ravens are the badge of this book, and they're going to go on a little bit into the next one, but not entirely.
So we're going to see, is it Jack and June? Are they going to make a reappearance?
They will, actually, yes, because ravens live a very long time. In the wild, they live till about 20, but as they are at the tower, they live much longer because they're protected and they don't have all the dangers of living in the wild. So they can live up to, I think, 40 and 50 years.
Gosh.
They're big birds, very interesting, very intelligent, and quite wicked, really, but wicked in what I consider to be a nice way.
Tell us more about Joan.
She has an amazing backstory, you know, and her mother came over with Marguerite of Anjou as one of her ladies in waiting when she married Henry VI. And of course, that meant that she was still with her at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her son, Marguerite's son, was killed. And so was Joan's father, who was a knight in her household. And then they were both taken to the Tower by Edward IV, who was back on the throne. This was when my Joan, who was about 7 or 8 or 9, when she was living in Margaret Beaufort's household, because her mother was with the Queen of England as was the exiled Queen of England in France. So Joan is kind of a second generation immigrant, which makes her quite interesting because she's not of British blood or of English blood. She is really more Mediterranean blood. She's very dark-haired, olive-skinned, which is not really the sort of appearance that was treasured in the courts of England. The sort of English rose was rather the thing that people liked, and she was not that. So that made her interesting to me. I just thought that she would stand out. She also had a lot of languages because she was born in Piedmont when her mother was in exile. That's in Italy, but was then part of the Duchy of Anjou.
Well, we haven't talked about what's next. Would it be a spoiler if I said the thing that made me have my light bulb moment with Joan, she was involved in the King's Great Matter?
Well, she will be involved in the King's Great Matter. Yes, you mean, was Catherine of Aragon a virgin?
Yes.
Indeed, she does get involved in that. The next book that I'm writing is the next part of Joan's life. She had served Elizabeth of York for about 16 years, but she also goes on to serve Catherine of Aragon and Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who marries the King of France. So she's a queen. So she serves 3 queens in her life. So that's quite good going. Because she was in Margaret Beaufort's household, she actually became extremely well educated. She was allowed the run of the library there, which was amazing. And she spoke Latin, she spoke French, she spoke Italian, and she spoke English. And in fact, Erasmus met her when he was visiting the children of King Henry VII. And he was most impressed by her because he thought that women never knew anything. And she has a very interesting time later on. She goes on at the end to find love and happiness in rather a scandalous way.
I saw she had a long life, and you said about Erasmus. There is a painting of Erasmus meeting the court children.
That's right, yes. And she's probably in it, but we don't know which she is. But yeah.
I will ask for the title in a moment if that's all right, but I feel we should say this before we move on. You've got Joan, and she's got tocophobia, I suppose we would say nowadays, the fear of pregnancy and childbirth. Did you find any primary sources to discuss this sort of thing? Diary entries or anything like that? Because, of course, it was something that women had to do in those days.
Yes, indeed, and especially if they were involved in the nobility or the gentry. That was what they were for, really, to provide the next generation. So she did have to marry, or was made to marry, and I don't know whether she did or not. There are no sources about this kind of thing. There is an amazing book that was written in Italy just before this period, the Troctula, which is, hang on, I'm turning around because it's in my, here we are. It's in my bookshelves here, and it is a compendium of women's medicine, and it was written by women for women. And it gives a lot of information about how to avoid pregnancy, for instance. I mean, there's lots of other information as well about childbirth, but one of the things it says is ways of avoiding pregnancy. And they are actually quite weird, some of them. I chose the most sensible, which you'll find in the book, which she tries to use. But some of them are, you can take a male weasel and let its testicles be removed and it be released alive. Jolly nice.
Yeah, it's lovely.
And then let the woman carry these testicles with her in her bosom and let her tie them in a goose skin or another skin, and she will not conceive. Well, I thought that was going a bit far, but this is the kind of thing. So there were sources of information that she could use, and I assume that she had read the Troctula when she was in Margaret Beaufort's house and could use her library.
Uh-huh. So we've got Joan as the narrator and the main character, but Elizabeth of York is obviously always in the background, and she is the person who makes a lot of what happens. How did you come to fictionalise her in your novel?
Well, I had to use her because she was very central to Joan's life. In her early marriage, she married Richard Guilford. Well, what happened was that I actually had read Alison Weir's seminal book on Elizabeth of York, which, grateful thanks to her, because she does a sort of definite in-depth sweep through Elizabeth's life. And that was more or less how I chose to see Elizabeth of York, as a queen, because she had been going to be a queen all her life, but she wasn't quite sure which king it was going to be that she married, and it ended up being Henry. And, she did all the right things. She provided all the children that were necessary for a dynasty to be started. And during Henry VII's reign before Elizabeth sadly died, everything was fine. There were all the right number of children. She was queen and he was king, and they were happy. And then things fell apart. And Joan is sort of part of all that, really, follows Elizabeth through all these difficulties and through her childbirths. And Elizabeth managed to survive most of them, but sadly succumbed to the last.
So, you've given us a brief introduction. What's next, and have you got a title for it?
Ah, yes, my next book. I'm in the middle of it now and due to come out in 2022. The title is The Queen's Lady. So it's like the Queen's with an apostrophe after the S, because it's three queens. And then what happens to her after she is involved with all these three queens. And I'm not going to tell you what that is because it's super. It's such a lovely story and it's a real romance. So, for once I've got a romance. Not strictly a recognisable romance that we would like to think of, but it is a romance and it will hopefully take my readers by surprise.
If I can speak for everybody, we will await this book quite impatiently, I think. Yeah, looking forward to it very much. It sounds brilliant. Okay, so listeners, First of the Tudors, The Tudor Crown and The Lady of the Ravens are out now, and links to these books, as well as Joanna's previous works, are in the description. If you have enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe for future episodes, and if you'd like to contact me, my email address is in the description as well. Joanna, this has been absolutely wonderful. You've just taught me so much, and I expect listeners are going to go away with so much that they've learned. And it has just been so lovely also to just talk about the War of the Roses and everybody involved. So many names, I won't name them. We know who they are. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, it's been great. Thank you very much, Charlie, for having me.
Join me on Monday the 26th of October, when I will be talking to Intezar Kanani, author of Thorn, Sunbolt, Memories of Ash, and the forthcoming The Theft of Sunlight. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 24, was recorded on the 30th of September and published on the 12th of October 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.